was the most celebrated man in New England, a hero they called godlike Daniel. But in one shocking speech, he betrayed everything his people stood for. This is the story of how Daniel Webster's name became a curse in the very place he called home. Today we've time traveled to a pivotal year in American history, 1850. The air is crackling with tension, a palpable unease hanging over the nation. The country is growing and prospering, but a deep and bitter divide is splitting it in two. The topic of slavery has reached a breaking point, and everywhere you go, people are arguing over the fate of the nation. It's a time of heated debates, angry speeches, and desperate attempts at compromise. And right in the middle of it all is a man who was once a hero, Daniel Webster. I first met Daniel Webster in the pages of a short story called The Devil and Daniel Webster by Stephen Vincent Benet. It tells the fictional story of a man who makes a deal with the devil. When it comes time to pay up, the man hires Daniel Webster to get him out of the deal. For decades, Daniel Webster was considered a living legend in American politics. He was a champion of the Union and the U.S. Constitution. His reputation was built on three key pillars. First, he was a master orator. His powerful voice and dramatic speaking style earned him the nickname the godlike Daniel. When he spoke, people listened. He was a master of persuasion whose words could rally a nation. Second, he was a brilliant lawyer, and as a lawyer, he had argued pivotal cases before the U.S. Supreme Court that strengthened the federal government. He was a defender of property rights and the Constitution, earning the respect of his peers across the country. And third, he was the voice of New England. He was seen as a protector of New England's interests, particularly its industrial economy, its maritime trade. He was a local boy who had become a national giant, a source of immense pride for the region. Now, as Daniel Webster's fame grew, so did the national tensions over slavery. The country was expanding, and with every new state came the explosive question, would it be free or enslaved? The North was becoming increasingly abolitionist, and for many, slavery was not just a political issue, but a moral abomination. And people were helping enslaved people escape via the Underground Railroad and fighting for change. The South viewed the North anti-slavery stance as a direct attack on their way of life and their economic system. They were threatening to secede from the Union, which Webster had dedicated his life to preserving. By 1850, the country was on the brink of civil war, and a final desperate attempt at compromise was made. And all eyes were on Daniel Webster, the man who had always defended the Union. His position on the upcoming compromise, which included a new Fugitive Slave Act, would define his legacy and seal his fate. Then on March 7, 1850, Daniel Webster delivered his most famous and controversial speech. In it, he urged Congress to pass the Compromise of 1850, which included the deeply unpopular Fugitive Slave Act. He argued that the nation was on the brink of civil war, and this compromise was a necessary evil to save the Union. He appealed to both sides, but in a move that shocked his anti-slavery base in New England, he publicly supported the Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens in free states to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves. For many, his eloquent speech was seen not as a masterful act of statesmanship, but as a moral failure and a betrayal of their values. The reaction from prominent New Englanders was swift and furious. For a region that had been at the forefront of the abolitionist movement, Webster's speech was seen as a profound betrayal. His name, once a symbol of New England pride, became a curse. The prominent Boston minister and abolitionist Theodore Parker was one of the most vocal critics. He delivered a blistering sermon where he condemned Webster as a traitor to the cause of freedom, calling his speech more infamous than any speech made by Benedict Arnold. Parker and others believed Webster had sacrificed his moral principles for a shot at the presidency. The famed poet and philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson was a former admirer who was utterly disillusioned. He wrote in his journal that the speech was a sad and bad performance. The betrayal was personal for him. He believed Webster's political ambitions had corrupted his genius. Emerson famously remarked, "Webster feels the coldness of the world to him because he is no longer its oracle, its defender, but its dupe and victim." The abolitionist poet John Greenleaf Whittier channeled the outrage of the people into a powerful poem titled Ichabod. The title, a Hebrew word meaning "the glory has departed," ouch, perfectly captured the sentiment. The poem lamented Webster's fall, mourning the loss of a hero who had betrayed the noblest cause. It was a widely read and deeply felt expression of the region's grief and anger. So fallen, so lost, the light withdrawn which once he wore, the glory from his gray hairs gone, forevermore. Whittier was a devout Quaker and a tireless advocate for liberty, and his work, including poems like A Prayer, was a cornerstone of the abolitionist movement in New England. But oh, for those this day can bring us unto us no joyful thrill, for those who under freedom's wing are bound in slavery's fetters still. Now, I used a line from this poem as the inspiration for the title of my book, Beneath Freedom's Wing, which is a story about the abolition movement and the Underground Railroad. The fury of those famous men was mirrored across New England, in homes and meeting houses where countless others felt a similar sense of disillusionment and betrayal. This outrage extended to even the smallest towns, where every patriot and abolitionist felt personally betrayed by the man they once revered. In the Maine village where I grew up, the outrage was strong against Daniel Webster. He had close ties to the area, having taught at Fryeburg Academy. He'd been welcomed at many a fireside. One local woman, Phoebe Fessenden, wife of Reverend Joseph P. Fessenden, who were both ardent supporters of the abolitionist movement, recorded her thoughts about Webster in a letter. She said, "And how ought I to feel toward the Northern senator, that traitor Daniel Webster, without whose influence this odious bill would never have become law? This man, whom heretofore we have all delighted to honor, was born and educated in the land of the Puritans, who has long sat under the banner of New England's praises and received the emblems of the Savior's sacrifice at New England altars. I cannot but feel this, that the statesmanship and moral bearings of this measure indicate strongly that what is said of him is true, that his intellect has become influenced and bewildered by strong drink, and his sense of virtue has become deadened by gross sensuality. Ought I to feel respect for such a man? In view of his dissolute character and the untold injuries his influence has procured for my sex, can I be true to the sacred interest of virtue myself and not regard him with detestation?" Now, Webster's efforts to keep the Union together unleashed a torrent of harm, as both enslaved and free black people were caught up in the net of slave hunters. Just a year after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, the law came to life with brutal clarity in Boston, the very heart of the abolitionist movement. A young man named Thomas Sims, who had escaped slavery in Georgia, was working as a waiter in Boston in 1851. When he was arrested under the new law, the city erupted in protest. Abolitionists, including many of the same people who had just condemned Daniel Webster, rallied to free Sims. They organized mass meetings and surrounded the courthouse demanding his release. But the federal government, with the full backing of the Fugitive Slave Act, moved to enforce the law. The courthouse was surrounded by an armed guard, and despite the public outcry, a judge ruled that Sims must be returned to slavery. The mayor of Boston, under federal orders, called out a large police detail to escort Sims to the docks. Under the protection of hundreds of armed men, Thomas Sims was put on a ship and sent back to a life of bondage. His case was a shocking and public display of the law's power. It proved that in the eyes of the federal government, a person's freedom could be taken away, even in a free state like Massachusetts. and that average citizens were required to assist. This event solidified the feeling that Daniel Webster had not just made a political misstep, but had actively betrayed the moral fabric of his home. Now, while many in New England condemned Daniel Webster, many others across the nation saw his actions in a completely different light. To them, the 7th of March speech was not a betrayal, but a heroic, even tragic act of statesmanship. His supporters argued that Webster, who had dedicated his life to preserving the Union, was willing to sacrifice his own popularity and his dreams of becoming president to prevent the nation from dissolving into civil war. They believed that his willingness to compromise on such a divisive issue was the ultimate act of courage, putting the good of the country ahead of his personal ambition. This perspective was so powerful that over a century later, John F. Kennedy would feature Daniel Webster in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Profiles in Courage. Kennedy highlighted Webster's decision to support the Compromise of 1850 as a prime example of a politician risking his career for the sake of the nation. For Kennedy, Webster's actions were the definition of political courage, a difficult choice made in the face of immense public pressure. Now, the Compromise of 1850 ultimately failed. Daniel Webster's desperate effort to save the Union only delayed the inevitable, and the country would plunge into civil war just over a decade later. For Webster himself, the damage was immediate. He never fully recovered from the political fallout and the public's perception of his betrayal. He died just 2 years later in 1852 from cirrhosis of the liver, a physical decline mirroring his professional one. Webster's legacy remains a source of debate to this day. To some, he is a tragic figure who risked everything for the sake of national unity, a true patriot who made an impossible choice. But to many in New England, he remains a cautionary tale of a man who sacrificed his moral integrity on the altar of political ambition. He was the godlike Daniel, but in the end he was brought down not by the devil, but by a moral compromise that his own people could never forgive. His actions did not stop the abolitionist movement. Instead, they galvanized it. In New England towns like the one I grew up in, ordinary people refused to accept the Fugitive Slave Act, and a hidden network was already at work helping to guide freedom seekers to safety. If you want to know more about the courage and commitment of abolitionists who stood up to men like Daniel Webster, check out my book, Beneath Freedom's Wing. It's the story of the Underground Railroad in western Maine, showing how a small New England town became a secret haven for those who dared to defy the law and fight for their freedom. Our nation's history is full of heroes, great orators like Daniel Webster, poets and leaders. But I'm fascinated by the quiet heroes, the ones who lived their beliefs in their everyday lives, like Joseph and Phoebe Fessenden, who spent their lives dedicated to the belief that we are all brothers and sisters, and if one of us is enslaved, we are all enslaved. And I will see you soon, somewhere in time.